Dating in Medieval England. Chapter 1. The Dust and the Drumbeat. The sun rose slowly over the rolling green hills of Lidford, gilding the thatched roofs with a faint shimmer of gold. Morning mist still clung to the trees, and dew kissed every wild flower at the roadside. In the far distance the drumming had already begun, a slow ceremonial thrum from the edge of the village, where the annual fair was rising from carts and canvas. Thomas stood in the dusty yard behind his uncle's leather shop, a length of tanned cowhide draped over one shoulder and a small wooden knife tucked into his belt. He was already sweating, not from labor, but from the anticipation that came once a year with the midsummer fair. It wasn't the drinking or the games that excited him most. It was the hope that, among the swirling crowd of merchants, pilgrims, jugglers, and musicians, he might meet a girl whose eyes stayed longer than a heartbeat. At 23, Thomas was neither tall nor short, neither handsome nor ugly. His hands were rough from the tannery, and he had a quiet way of moving, like someone used to the stink of boiling hides and the need for silence in the curing shed. But his eyes were alert, curious, and brown like wet bark after rain. His uncle, Oswin, stood behind the stall now, arranging gloves, belts, and purses with care. The fair was business, and no daydreams would excuse Thomas from his duties. "Are you listening, boy?" Oswin growled. "That one's to sell for no less than 2 pence, sheepskin, fine stitching." Thomas nodded, accepting the rhythm of the day. Work, smile, nod, count the change. But still, his gaze drifted toward the crowd, the tents, and the chance that somewhere out there life might shift, even just a little. Meanwhile, just past the far edge of the green, a girl sat on the rear stoop of her father's inn, brushing the last of the flour from her apron. Alice, barely 18, daughter of Will the innkeeper, was not permitted to wander the fair unsupervised. Her father said the world was no place for a girl with too much reading in her head. But he was drunk by noon most days, and her older brother had gone off to war. There was no one left to argue when she stepped into the sunshine. Alice was quiet by nature, but her thoughts ran fierce and fast. She read borrowed psalters and old stories from the friar's collection. She knew Latin well enough to catch the priest in a lie once, a memory that still made her smile. But she was also lonely. Her days were filled with trays of trenchers, spilled ale, and wiping benches. The fair was the one day each year where strangers came, where people's voices filled the streets, where she didn't feel like a shadow in her own life. She tied her hair with a faded ribbon and slipped into the flow of the morning crowd, heart light and hungry for something unnamed. The fair smelled of cinnamon, horse sweat, and roasting goose. A juggler balanced knives beside a cart of dried apples. A friar shouted blessings while selling charms. A dwarf in a crimson cap walked a trained goose on a leash. Somewhere music rose from a hurdy-gurdy, lopsided and sweet. Thomas stood behind his stall, calling out prices, half his attention on the crowd. That's when he saw her. A girl in a plain linen dress, with a faded blue ribbon in her dark hair, paused at a booth selling combs and trinkets. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't showing off. She simply turned her head slowly, as if the world was a book she was still deciding whether to read. Their eyes met. For a moment, a heartbeat. Maybe two. And then she moved on. But that was enough. Thomas barely noticed the coin he dropped or the glove he mispriced. For the rest of the day he searched for her in every corner of the fair, and Alice, walking through the maze of tents and banners, told herself she wasn't looking for him either, that boy with the leather apron and those strange, soft eyes. But the fair was not done with them. The next day they would meet again, not by design, but by the slow, ancient magic that the world uses when it wants to change two lives at once. Chapter 2. The Singing Wall. The second day of the fair dawned cooler, with a fine mist lingering over the hedgerows. The sky threatened rain, but the village green was already humming. Jugglers, bakers, and cloth sellers setting out wares beneath oilcloth and canvas. Thomas had hoped the rhythm of work would dull his thoughts, but it hadn't. He had dreamt of her, the girl with the blue ribbon, and now every face in the crowd seemed to blur past him, unimportant. She had changed something, not by speaking, not by smiling, but merely by being. And now he wanted more. By midday, his Uncle Oswin had begun grumbling about Thomas's longer-than-usual silences. "What's gotten into you?" he muttered, handing over a sheathed knife to a passing knight. "You sell like your head's in the clouds?" "Just tired?" Thomas lied. Oswin snorted. "We'll rest when we're in the ground." By late afternoon, Thomas could no longer pretend. On the pretext of needing more laces from the cloth merchants, he slipped away from the stall and ducked into the crowd. He didn't know where he was going, only that his feet moved toward the church at the top of the hill, St. Leonard's, with its gray stone walls and crooked bell tower. It was quieter there, removed from the clamor of the fair. The bells had rung just before noon, calling for vespers, and as he passed behind the chapel wall, he heard it, singing, a woman's voice, soft, uncertain, not trained, but beautiful for its honesty. She was humming a hymn he recognized, Jesu Dulcis Memoria. He turned the corner, and there she was. She stood beneath the wall's arch, eyes closed, fingers clasped before her as if in prayer. But her mouth moved not for piety, but for melody, a private, shy song, as if meant only for the sky above her. She noticed him too late to pretend he hadn't heard. Alice flushed. That wasn't for you. Thomas held his hands up. Then I thank the saints for my sin. She blinked, then smiled despite herself, a quick, nervous gesture. You're the leather worker, she said. He nodded. And you're the girl with the ribbon. Alice glanced down as if surprised to find it still tied in her hair. I'm Alice, she said, brushing a loose strand behind her ear. Thomas, he replied. Silence fell again, but not uncomfortably. The church bells were still now, the fair distant. Only birdsong filled the space between them. What brings you here? She asked, at last, ... He hesitated. Truth? She nodded, ... I hoped you'd come. She looked at him then, really looked, and her reply came not in words, but in her gaze, steady, measuring, almost like a challenge. And then, softer, then perhaps I'm not sorry I did. They spoke a while longer beneath the arch, about small things, where she lived, what he did, how her father's inn served stew too watery and ale too bitter. She made him laugh, quietly, and he made her feel, for the first time in months, not like a daughter or a servant, but like herself. When they finally parted, it was with a glance that lingered. She left with a promise to return the next day. And Thomas, returning to his uncle's stall, no longer cared what he sold or to whom. He had found something richer than corn, a moment, a name, and a reason to wait for tomorrow. Chapter 3. A Promise of Rain. The next morning came with low gray clouds and a wind that carried the scent of wet grass and chimney smoke. It was one of those English days where the sky seemed heavy with secrets, and the earth waited patiently to hear them. Thomas rose early, not from duty, but from anticipation. He didn't wait for Oswin's grumbled commands. He was out the door before the cock crowed a second time, cheeks freshly scraped, hair still damp from the stream behind the tannery. By the time he reached the church wall, the clouds had begun to weep lightly, a drizzle falling like silk threads. He stood under a leaning yew, watching the road below, heart thudding with quiet, stubborn hope. And then she came, not through the fair, but down the narrow path from the village. She wore the same pale linen dress, but over it a woolen cloak the color of stone, the hood pulled halfway down. She walked like she knew she shouldn't be seen, yet like she wouldn't stop even if someone called her name. When she saw him, the corners of her mouth lifted without hesitation. You waited. Might have waited through rain or fire, he said. She raised an eyebrow. You speak like a minnesinger. Thomas smiled sheepishly. I only know one song. It's yours. That startled her, not in fear, but in that vulnerable, honest way that made her look down and pick at her sleeve. He didn't press further. Instead, he stepped closer, holding out a small object wrapped in oilskin. For you. Alice hesitated, then took it. Inside was a comb, made of horn, polished and carved with a simple pattern of vines. Not fancy, not showy, but lovingly made and smooth beneath her fingers. I shaped it last winter, he said. Didn't know why. Now I do. Alice turned it over in her hands, then met his gaze. Thank you. They sat side by side on the low stone edge behind the chapel, legs just barely touching, rain misting their shoulders. The village buzzed below, but up here time slowed. She asked about his trade, how hides were soaked in oak bark and lime, how hands stank for days, how no one respected a tanner until they needed boots that lasted. He told her about the tools, the way the grain of leather changed with each beast, and how he secretly liked the quiet of the curing shed. She listened. She asked questions. She smiled more often now, though never for show, only when something true slipped through. When it was time to part, she tucked the comb into the inside of her cloak. "I won't be allowed out tomorrow," she said. He felt the ache of it before the words had even landed. "My father's cousin is visiting. He drinks worse than father and stares too long. I'll be needed at the inn." Thomas nodded, trying not to show the disappointment blooming behind his ribs. "I understand." "But," she added, "the next evening at twilight the stone steps behind the grain store." He looked up sharply. "I'll be there." And then she was gone, swallowed by the damp road and the low hiss of rain. Thomas walked home in silence. The village seemed duller now, but it didn't matter. His hands ached from work, his clothes were wet, but something inside him had kindled, not with fire, but with a slow, steady glow that warmed through and through. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know how one courted a girl like her, thoughtful, sharp, not easily charmed. But he knew this. He wanted to try, even if it meant sneaking out after nightfall, even if it meant risking her father's wrath, even if it meant waiting another lifetime. She had taken the comb, but that was enough. Chapter 4. Behind the Grain Store. The evening arrived with long shadows, and a hush in the hedgerows. Twilight in Lidford came slowly, the sun reluctant to surrender behind the moor, casting a warm gold along the upper stone walls, while the streets below sank into blue. Thomas made his way down the narrow alley that ran behind the grain store, his boots soft on the damp earth. It was a quiet place, half forgotten by most, where sacks of barley were kept under tarpaulins and cats prowled for mice. He arrived early, as always, and waited with his back to the wall, arms folded, heartbeat steady, but quick. She came just after the first bat swooped above the rooftops. Alice moved with purpose, cloak wrapped tightly around her. Her steps were fast, but not from fear. She was simply cold and eager. "You're early," she whispered. "So are you." Hay smiled, and she sat beside him on the stone ledge that ringed the grain house. This close, in the blue hour light, Thomas could see the line of freckles across her cheekbones. She smelled of wood smoke and soap. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly. "My cousin is passed out in a hayloft," she replied, voice dry, "and my father hasn't noticed I'm gone. Or doesn't care." Thomas looked at her then, truly looked, and saw the steel behind her gentleness. She wasn't timid, he realized. She had simply been holding her breath in a world that seldom let her speak. "Tell me something," she said suddenly. "What sort of something? Something about you. Something no one knows." He blinked, caught off guard. Then, after a pause, "When I was 10, I broke the stained glass window in the chapel with a slingstone, the one with St. George. The priest said it was a wind from the devil. I never confessed." Alice burst out laughing, a soft, surprised sound that echoed against the wall. He grinned. "Your turn." She hesitated, then leaned a little closer. "I've read a banned book." His eyes widened. She nodded, eyes glinting. "It belonged to a traveling scholar. He stayed at the inn when I was 15. He left it behind. Writings of a Moorish physician. There were drawings." She blushed. "Detailed drawings." Thomas laughed, nearly choking. "I hid it under the floorboards. Still have it." "I should be scandalized," he said. "You are," she smiled. They sat together, knees brushing, the silence between them comfortable. Now, no games. No pretense. He turned to her, more serious now. "Do you want to be married off?" "Not by my father," she said. "He'd sell me to the highest bidder if he thought it'd earn him another barrel of ale." "And if it were your choice?" She looked down at her hands. "I'd want it slow, steady, someone who listens. Someone who doesn't just want my dowry or my womb." Thomas was quiet a moment, then said, "I don't know if I'll ever be a master. I may never own land, but I'd listen." She met his gaze. "You already do." Their fingers brushed, tentative, searching, then rested together on the cold stone. They didn't kiss. Not yet. In their world, such a thing had weight. But the warmth between them, it was stronger than touch. Above them, the first stars blinked into sight. The weeks that followed passed like a whispered song. They met at twilight, behind walls, beneath trees, on the church hill, when no one watched, each meeting a page in a slow, beautiful book. Thomas carved her a second cone, this one finer, with a tiny rose at the base. Alice brought him scraps of parchment, notes copied from her hidden book. She taught him words in Latin, and laughed when he mispronounced them, and though they never spoke it aloud, the shape of their future began to form like a house half dreamed. But the world was watching, and soon someone else would notice. Chapter 5. Eyes in the Dark. The autumn rains arrived early that year, long before the fields were ready. Water ran down the cobbled lanes like silver ribbons, and the hearths of Lidford never went cold. Smoke curled from every rooftop, and the air was thick with damp wool and the sharp tang of peat. Thomas and Alice continued to meet, always in secret, always with the quiet urgency of something precious and fragile. Their stolen hours were small pockets of warmth in a world that had little mercy for quiet love. But they were not invisible, not entirely. It began with a whisper. Old Meg, who kept a stall of onions and beeswax, told Oswin that his nephew had been seen lurking in odd corners. Then the cooper's apprentice made a joke about the innkeeper's clever daughter that ended with a cracked lip from Thomas's fist, and still he met her, always at dusk, always beneath the edge of sight, until one night someone followed them. They met behind the mill that evening, where the stream rushed fast and loud, and the air was thick with midges and mist. Alice was barefoot, her shoes slung over one shoulder, and Thomas laughed as she tiptoed across the stones. But they weren't alone. Halfway through a quiet conversation about whether the river ever froze solid, Thomas said yes. Alice said no. Alice stiffened. She heard at first the snap of a twig. Then a shape moved behind the trees. She stepped back, heart pounding. "Did you hear?" But Thomas was already on his feet, turning toward the darkness. Out stepped Warren, the cousin, broad, red-faced, drunk even in the evening. His grin was oily. Well, You sneak out for a walk and find a rat in the bush. Alice's face turned pale. Go home, Warren. Warren took a step closer. Father's looking for you. And your friend here, does he know what kind of girl he's playing with? Thomas stepped between them, fists clenched, ... Warren sneered. You think you're clever, leather boy? Think the innkeeper'll let you take what isn't yours? Thomas said nothing, but the look in his eyes was steel. Warren spat on the ground. You'll regret this. She will too. Then he was gone, melting back into the woods like a bad smell carried on the fog. They stood in silence for a long time. Finally, Alice whispered, He'll tell my father. Thomas nodded. I should have been more careful, she said. No, he replied. We should have had the right to be honest. She looked at him, then, eyes wide, wet with more than mist. What do we do? Thomas took her hand. We prepare, we find help. And if your father comes with fists or threats, he'll find I don't stand alone. Her voice was a thread. Would you leave with me? If it came to that, he didn't hesitate. Yes. And though neither of them said it, they both knew the truth. What they had was no longer just a secret. It was a stand. That night Thomas spoke to Oswin, and to his surprise the old man listened. You love her? The tanner asked gruffly. Thomas nodded. Then act like it, Oswin said. Not with hiding. With a roof, a table. A trade to show her father you're no fool. Thomas blinked. You'd help me? Oswin sighed. I was young once. Loved a girl, too. Couldn't give her enough. She married a miller. I still remember the sound of her laugh. The next morning, Oswin marched to the guildmaster and demanded Thomas be made apprentice in full. He's got hands, and he's got heart. That's all a man needs. But not all battles are won with leather and honesty. At the inn, Warren had already poisoned the well. Alice's father, red-faced and shaking, barred her from leaving the house. The combs were burned, the books were taken, and the door was locked. But Alice, clever, fierce, and determined, had already begun to plan, and soon a letter would find its way into Thomas's hands, sealed with wax ... folded with care, and inside a single line in her tidy hand: "If you love me, meet me where the river meets the moor at dusk." Chapter 6. Where the River Meets the Moor. The sky was heavy with rain. The evening Thomas left the village. He carried little: a satchel with dried meat, a carving knife, a pouch of coin Oswin had pressed into his hand. But he walked with purpose, boots striking the muddy path beyond Lidford's edge, where the river Walla tumbled through rocks toward the wide, wind-swept moor. He didn't know if Alice would be there. Didn't know if her father had torn the letter before she could send it, if she'd been caught or worse, married off to someone cruel, with calloused hands and no interest in her soul. But he went anyway, because love, true love, didn't wait for permission. And just as the sun kissed the moor's edge, all fire and bruised lavender, he saw her. She stood beneath a twisted hawthorn, cloak whipped by the wind. Her eyes found him, and she smiled through the tears in her lashes. Not from sadness, from the sheer enormity of relief ... "You came," she whispered. "I'd have come if the whole of Devon were between us," he said. They embraced, a long, trembling thing that said all the words they hadn't had the chance to say. Behind them the river whispered. Alice looked at him. "We've nowhere to go." Thomas nodded. "Then we go forward." They walked east, along the river's edge, toward the tin roads and the high sheep paths. Word had spread of a settlement beyond the moor, Tavistock, with its abbey and promise of work. A place big enough to vanish into, but not so big that a name meant nothing. Along the way they traded stories for food, labor for lodging. Thomas mended belts and harnesses. Alice helped with berths and brewed tea from hedgerow herbs. They were young, but people saw their kindness, their quiet hunger to build something together. And slowly, like spring pushing through the frost, a life began. They married in a chapel made of granite, its roof patched with moss. There were no fine clothes, no feast, no father's blessing. But Alice wore her ribbon again, and Thomas wore a smile as wide as the moor. The priest gave them a Bible, a loaf of bread, and a prayer. Years passed. They rented a single-room cottage with a lean-to for Thomas's work. Alice grew vegetables and kept hens. She taught village girls their letters, a scandal to some, a blessing to others. And when they had their first child, a boy with her clever eyes and his stubborn chin, the midwife said she'd never seen a mother so calm. They named him Oswin, not out of duty, but of gratitude. Many winters later, when Thomas's hair had begun to gray, and Alice's hands had grown thin, they still met by the river sometimes. He would bring her a comb, always a new one, always from horn or bone, each finer than the last, and she would sing for him, not a full song, just the barest hint of the hymn he once overheard behind the chapel wall. They never returned to Lidford. They never looked back. They didn't have to. They had built something stronger than memory, a life chosen, a love protected, a quiet, stubborn joy in a world that rarely offered it freely. The end.